I accidentally ruined my sister's life. Nothing hurts quite like betrayal from family. The closer you are, the more heartbreaking it is. When my sister decided to stab me in the back, the pain was worse than anything I've ever felt in my life. What hurts more is the guilt I continue to feel for my retaliation. To provide some more context, let me start from the beginning. Deborah and I were more than just siblings. We were best friends. There was almost nothing we didn't share or talk about. I always had her back, and she always had mine. There was almost nothing I wouldn't do for my kid sister. I remember having to deal with a fair number of her classmates who thought it was a good idea to bully her. It was this annoying clique, headed by a silly girl named Maddie, who was jealous of my sister for beating her at the school spelling bee. Maddie and her posse started taunting her, leaving all sorts of messages in her bag and locker. Debbie decided not to tell anyone about it, not even me. She thought she could deal with it on her own, and that the bullies would eventually leave her alone. As is often the case with bullies, silence only enabled them more, and soon they got emboldened enough to attack her physically. Even then, all she told me was that Maddie was being annoying. It wasn't until her grades started slipping and her usually vibrant energy began to wane that I discovered that whatever she was facing with Maddie was certainly more than just annoying. So, I decided to figure out what was going on myself. I offered a guy in her class $10 to tell me what I wanted to know. When I finally found out what was going on, I was livid. No one, absolutely no one, bullied my sister and got away with it. So I decided to get back at the girls. I, too, started to drop creepy notes in Maddie's locker. Obviously, Maddie and her friends suspected that it was Debbie, but they couldn't prove it. Then one day, I found out that one of Maddie's friends, a short, stocky girl named Anna, lived close to our home. I snuck over one evening, stole their little Pomeranian puppy, and left a note stating that if she and her friends didn't stop, the pup might not survive. Obviously, I wasn't going to harm the dog. I'm not a monster. However, Anna seemed to get the message, and soon Maddie and her clique suddenly stopped bullying my sister. I returned the pup after a week. It wasn't just me looking out for her, though. When I first started dating, I was with this girl named Aqua. I was completely enamored, and I considered myself extremely lucky to be with her. I had started thinking about how we'd be together forever and how I'd tell our children that their mother and I had been high school sweethearts. Everything seemed to be going well, and I was quite happy in the relationship. However, Debbie felt something was off about Aqua. She tried to get to the bottom of it, but the feelings persisted. During summer vacation, Debbie decided to take a dance class. It turns out that Aqua was also taking the dance class, and they spent some time together. At first, Debbie was untrusting of her, but they started to get closer and hung out a few times. One day, Debbie decided to go through Aqua's phone. She claimed it was a final test to see if Aqua was really someone she could trust to be with me. What she found was that apparently, my girlfriend had another boyfriend, and it seemed like I was the side piece. It turned out that Aqua was only really affectionate when she wanted to ask for a favor. I confronted her about it and eventually broke up with her. Honestly, I dodged a bullet, and it was all thanks to my sister. Now let me tell you what happened a decade later. When I was a 24-year-old struggling veterinarian, I had just finished college and got a job as an intern at a local vet hospital. The pay wasn't impressive, but at least I wasn't starving. I had a plan for how I would develop myself over the next few years. Debbie, on the other hand, had skipped college altogether and got a job as a bartender. To the best of my knowledge, she was doing just fine. I made sure we got to see each other at least once a week, but sometimes it was challenging with my long working hours. I met someone new, Camila. Camila was sweet, and I fell in love almost instantly. There was just something about her that made her so lovable. At first, I was worried about this, as Debbie's intuition was usually right. I wondered if I had made the right decision by choosing to be with Camila. I started to observe her cautiously. Between work and spending time with Camila, Debbie and I got to spend less time together, at least physically. I made sure I still called often and we used FaceTime a lot. Debbie continued to subtly complain about me not spending as much time with her as I used to, but I didn't think it was such a big issue. We were adults, and it was a part of life to have less time for certain people and more time for others. I loved my sister, but I couldn't be available whenever she wanted me to be, or so I thought. Debbie had a different plan, though. She decided to go too far. She started sending random anonymous texts to my girlfriend, Camila, accusing me of all sorts. Camila was concerned, thinking I might be cheating on her. I assured her I wasn't, and even gave her access to my messages and call logs. She blocked the numbers that were texting her, and for a while it was relatively quiet. I kept wondering who could be responsible for these messages, and it became clear that someone was trying to ruin my relationship. I never once suspected Debbie. I got so paranoid about it that I decided to hire a private investigator to find out who was responsible. It took a while, but eventually, the investigator discovered the truth. It was Debbie all along. I was more confused than anything else. Why would she try to hurt me like that? What was the point of it all? My confusion turned into anger, and I decided to give her a taste of her own medicine. I anonymously reported to the police that Debbie was involved in a drug trafficking ring. I expected the police to show up, give her a bit of a scare, and then I would confess and warn her against attacking me. However, things escalated more than I expected. The police raided her home, and she tried to put up a fight, thinking she was being robbed. A police officer tackled her, breaking a rib and dislocating her knee. She spent a week in the hospital and 2 extra months recovering from her injuries. She lost her job, and the police officer faced no repercussions for his actions. Honestly, I feel a little guilty about what happened to her. I haven't been able to tell anyone that I was responsible for what happened to Debbie. Sometimes I wonder if I should let her know and apologize, but I worry that it would be such a big issue that she'd cut me off completely. I did, after all, ruin her life. This on the plus side. After that incident, Debbie seemed to become more understanding of me, not having as much time for her as before. In fact, she started to become good friends with Camila. It made me wonder if maybe my actions weren't so bad after all. Perhaps it was a good thing that I hurt my sister so much, but sometimes I still wrestle with guilt, and I'm impressed by the extent to which someone I loved and thought I knew could go to in order to get my time and attention. Honestly, I wonder if it's possible to reconnect with a person like this. Maybe they would need therapy and a significant amount of time away from them before even considering it. One thing is clear, sometimes even the people we've known and loved for years can surprise us with their actions. It's hard to believe that they're capable of such behavior, but I learned the hard way that anyone, even a close family member, can go to great lengths to get what they want. That's the end of the story. If you have any further questions or need assistance with anything else, feel free to ask. After the incident with Debbie and the police, I found myself torn between guilt and relief. Guilt for causing my sister so much pain, and relief that the campaign against me had finally stopped. I couldn't bring myself to confess my involvement to her, fearing the consequences it might have on our relationship. Debbie, surprisingly, didn't hold a grudge against me for my reduced availability in her life. Instead, she started to adapt to my changing priorities, and we slowly found a new equilibrium in our relationship. She even became friends with Camila, who had, at first, been a source of concern for her. It was as if our shared experiences had brought them closer. As time passed, the wounds in our relationship seemed to heal, and we were able to rebuild our trust. However, the memory of what had transpired still haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt and responsibility for what had happened to Debbie. It was a burden I carried in silence, unable to confide in anyone. I often wondered if I should tell Debbie the truth and apologize for my actions, but the fear of the consequences held me back. What if she couldn't forgive me? What if it shattered our newly repaired relationship? The weight of my secret became increasingly heavy, and I found myself at a crossroads. And so the story continues, with the uncertainty of whether or not I should finally reveal my role in the events that had unfolded, and if our relationship could withstand such a revelation. Our next story is Shadow of Betrayal, a tale of intimacies, mysterious messages, and destruction. A lawyer's pro-revenge on a wife-beater. Let's call him Joe. I have to call him something. The man I ruined, but I can't call him by his real name, so let's call him Joe. Joe was a wife-beater. I was hired by Joe's brother-in-law, the brother of the wife that Joe beat. My client was also Joe's ex-business partner. Aside from the whole "you beat up my sister" thing, my client had another beef with Joe, a serious business beef. My client took it to court and gave me the case to handle. Joe and his lawyers fought me long and hard. Joe was confident that his bullcrap and outright perjury would carry the day. It had always worked before. His bullcrap and his fists had won him a good settlement with his ex-wife, free of child support, so maybe he thought that threats and lies would carry the day once more, but he was wrong, and after the trial I had a judgment against him, a big judgment, far bigger than he could pay. Joe twisted and he turned and he shimmied and shaked. But after a while, I'd located and taken all his assets. It was easy, really. Joe had no thought of consequences, and so he didn't lawyer up until it was too late. If one of my clients ever sues you, you're in trouble, because my clients lawyer up before they even know your name. But Joe didn't lawyer up until the process server threw the papers at his feet, and by then it was far too late. I went through Joe's assets like a meat grinder, and after a while Joe had but one property left, a house, and he clung to that house, for it was rented out, and his sole source of income. Joe lived in the unfinished basement, and he survived on what the upstairs tenants paid him. He cashed their rent checks at payday loan places, paying hefty fees, but it was worth it, because he knew that I'd garnish any bank account that he opened. Joe managed to hide his rental place from me for a while, because he owned it through a numbered company, but my investigator found him one day and followed him home. Joe self-repped his way through the next stage, which took a couple of years while I punctured his corporate veils and his sad efforts at a fraudulent conveyance. But in the end, I had his last house, the house where he lived in the unfinished basement. Joe stepped out one day to get a pack of cigarettes, and when he came back, the sheriff had changed the locks. Can my client at least live in the basement? Joe's lawyer said to me, pro bono, because by this point Joe had nothing to pay lawyers. I knew the pro bono guy. He practiced law nearby. As I was talking to him, I could see pro bono guy's office window across the parking lot from my office tower window. Ask the purchaser, I said. It's out of my hands. And it was. I told Joe's lawyer that the new owner, a nominee, one of my client's employees, wouldn't let him back into his crapey basement apartment. Joe, a man who had owned this and that here and there and all over town, had just lost the last thing he owned on earth, except for his truck. He still had his truck left. Joe's truck was this big butt-gas-guzzling beast that he drove around in. It was too old and too frail to be worth seizing, so I let Joe keep it, and I was glad I did that, because now the truck was where Joe slept, until he made a mistake and lost his truck too. He lost his truck the day I got a phone call from the tenants at the house that Joe used to own. He came back and parked his truck across the driveway. The tenant said, adding that Joe had gone nuts. He'd parked his truck there in a rage, out of spite, and then walked into town saying he'd be back later that day to sleep in his truck. Can you get around the truck? I asked. The tenant could not. The driveway was blocked. I called one of the tow truck guys that I used to defend back in my criminal lawyer days, and in a couple of hours that truck was gone and parked somewhere else, somewhere special, in accordance with my specific instructions. My guy wants his truck back. The pro bono lawyer said the next day when he called me. Not happening, I said. I stood in my office 15 floors above the parking lot and looked down where I imagined my pro bono counterpart was standing in his office facing the same lot. But you have no right to the truck, he said. He has no right to block a man's driveway, I replied. It was terrible, really standing up high, pronouncing words that took away a man's final asset, the last thing he owned on earth. I imagined that this must be what God feels like, before he strips a man of everything and sends him to heck. Are you really going to make me go to court over this? Said pro bono guy. Do what you gotta do, I said, and pro bono guy said his client was coming in the next day to sign an affidavit, and then they were going to court to get the truck back. But I was unconcerned. The next day was bright and the sun was shining and it was 9 a.m. As I looked out the window and sipped my coffee, my phone rang. I picked up. It was pro bono man. Why didn't you tell me that Joe's truck was parked right outside my office? His voice was tight, and I could tell that he must have been shaking with anger. Is that so? I said, staring out at Joe's truck, parked 15 stories below me. How careless of my bailiff to leave the truck where your client could easily take it back. I really must speak to him. Very funny. My client's going to sue. No, he isn't. He's going to get in that truck and drive away right now. I told my tow guy to fill up the tank, and he gave it an oil change too, Grady's. Tell your client to get in his truck and drive off, and that if I ever see that truck again, I'll seize it to satisfy the rest of my client's judgment. Pro bono guy tried to argue, but I was firm. Then I put the phone down and picked up my coffee. A few minutes later, Joe walked out of his lawyer's office and over to his truck. As he walked, I saw that there was no longer a bounce to his step. The joy had gone out of him. Joe wasn't the first guy I ruined, and he won't be the last. But he is the only one whose final ruin I witnessed from on high, from my office, and it was one of the most powerful experiences of my life. Watching a man walk to his truck, knowing that I had stripped him of everything else he had, and that he owed his possession of his last asset, his truck, to my mercy. Joe drove away, his big ancient truck spilling clouds of smoke from the exhaust. I was pretty sure I'd never hear from him again, and I never did.